Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we talk about the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam.
So one of the things when you're a professor is, you spend an immense amount of time learning and then writing materials, and sometimes you just kind of hit the jackpot. You're interested in an area that at the time you start working on it is tremendously obscure. There aren't many people thinking about it. And then all of a sudden it bubbles to the top of the news. And that happened to me in 2000. I had been writing about voting rights and election law. And there really were only about 5 or 6 professors in the United States in law schools who wrote about this stuff. And then came the election of 2000, which, as you may remember, went on for weeks as they tried to count the votes. And I actually came over to this studio here at Stanford. It was the predecessor studio to this. And I think I did like 11 layer news hours and 7 nightlines in a 20-day period because there just weren't many people who knew about this. And our guest today is having a kind of similar effect.
That's right. We're thrilled to welcome Bernadette Meyler here. Bernie is a Stanford grad with a PhD in English from UC Irvine. And Bernie, you wrote a book about pardoning in 17th century England. Theaters of Pardoning. It's coming out in Cornell. And it's about Shakespearean figures pardoning a lot of people. And today we've got a Shakespearean president, maybe, pardoning a lot of people. So welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here, Pam and Joe. This is really an opportunity.
Thanks. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the pardoning power.
Yeah, so I actually came to this in several different ways, kind of fortuitously, as you were saying, Pam. So first of all, I was reading a lot of 17th century drama when I was pursuing my PhD and wondering why all of these people are getting pardoned at the ends of plays. And then at the same time, I was reading a lot of political theory and reading about sovereignty and especially about emergency powers and thinking, well, isn't pardoning kind of a type of emergency power too? It's a way for the sovereign or the king to exercise some kind of exceptional authority. And so that's how I got here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In the book, you talk about the Gunpowder Plot and how the king could have pardoned people after the Gunpowder Plot, although I sort of wondered to myself, well, doesn't he want them all to be executed?
Of course. So I think that pardoning in a political sense is very much a strategic decision. You can decide that it's better for terrorists, you could call the Gunpowder Plotters terrorists, to be executed, or you could decide that, well, there's a pretty large constituency behind the Gunpowder Plot. It's, there are a lot of Catholics in England who are feeling religious oppression at the time that Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators decide to try to blow up the parliament. And you could say, well, actually, pardoning them is going to allow for more religious harmony within the nation and allow us to move forward better, rather than what we have even today, which is a kind of commemoration of Guy Fawkes Day with bonfires and burnt effigies and things like that.
Bernie, you're a historian in a way, as well as someone with a doctorate in English. A lot of our audience might say, what's the connection to law? And I know you've heard this before. What do you say to them?
Yeah, so the field of law and literature has had a lot of different incarnations, but I would say that my version of it kind of looks at the way in which audiences and actors bring concepts from cultural spheres into legal and political arenas and back again. So in this book in particular, I'm really interested in how the idea of pardoning becomes something that's highly contested within drama and within plays in the 17th century, and that the audiences to those plays can kind of bring that concept and the sets of concepts that are developed in drama back into the political and the legal arena. So Pam mentioned the Gunpowder Plot. I'm interested in how King James I was one of the audience members or in fact, the primary audience member for one of the performances of Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. I'm also interested in how later plays like Philip Massenger's The Bondman get played before revolutionaries and then before members of the Restoration, once King Charles II is restored to the throne. So how are these concepts kind of getting developed in culture and in drama and then getting brought back into the legal sphere and into the political arena?
So if you thought about that in terms of today as opposed to back then, I mean, back then it's plays in front of the king. You know, there's the famous story, I think also of, is it the Earl of Essex getting Shakespeare to do Richard II, which is about the deposition of a king right as he's about to march on London. And so I wonder, do you think the same kind of thing happens today? That kind of interplay back and forth between the world of the arts and performing arts and the world of politics?
Definitely. I think it's largely in different genres. I mean, we might be thinking now about how Hamilton has affected our understanding of the Constitution.
Yeah, immigrants, they
today.
get the job done.
Right, exactly. But also, I think there's been some interesting literature on the so-called CSI effect in criminal law. So many people watch these television shows that show elaborate use of forensic evidence in criminal investigation. And some prosecutors' offices have posited that jurors will no longer convict without forensic evidence. So there's a debate about whether jurors actually have this view. It seems like the evidence suggests that they don't. But apparently, in prosecutors' offices, people are still trained about how to work around the CSI effect and get a conviction even if you don't have forensic evidence. So I think that maybe television, musicals are the medium of choice now, whereas plays were in the 17th century.
And I think at the end of the session, Bernie, I'm going to ask you what you think President Trump is influenced when he thinks about pardoning. So I'm just warning you on that so we can get the answer. It's like Final Jeopardy. We'll ask you that at the end.
But I think the point in part that you're making, Bernie, is understanding the culture, which is what the law and literature movement does, tells you something about how the society develops its understanding of law, that the culture both reflects and is reflected by what's in the law.
Exactly, right. And I think that a lot of law and literature at an earlier moment had been looking mostly at, sort of how literature reflects legal concepts. But I'm particularly interested in how culture kind of generates changes within our legal consciousness and perceptions of how law should operate.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Bernadette Meyler about her book, Theaters of Pardoning.
Well, Bernie, I wonder if you could help us with just some definitions here. So we're going to talk about pardoning, but there's amnesty, there's pardoning. You could commute a sentence. I mean, tell us what the difference is.
Yes. Well, so there are a lot of scales along which pardoning occurs. So the pardon power under the U.S. Constitution is given to the president federally, but that encompasses a number of other possible acts. So commutation is part of the pardon power, but it doesn't involve a full pardon. So if a president commutes the sentence of someone on death row, they're not going to leave prison. They're just not going to be executed. Also, there can be other forms of reprieve that are short of a full pardon.
So what is a full pardon? What does it mean?
Yeah, a full pardon allows someone both to be reprieved from punishment and to have their future unencumbered by the crime that they committed. Now, I don't think it involves erasing the fact of the crime. So former Sheriff Joe Arpaio is asking for his entire record to be erased.
Yeah, I guess we should say for listeners who don't know who Joe Arpaio is, he was this notorious sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona. He was convicted of contempt, right, for not obeying federal court orders telling him to stop mistreating suspects on the street, particularly Latinos. He was convicted, and then while his case was on appeal, he received a pardon from the president.
Exactly. And former Sheriff Arpaio wants for his entire record to be expunged. Now, generally, that requires an additional procedure. The judge is in charge of whether someone's conviction would be expunged. He's saying a pardon itself should entail that. Now, I think that gets back to Joe's question about, what's the difference between pardon and amnesty. Amnesty, even by its very derivation, entails a certain amount of forgetting. So it is related to amnesia. And there was a procedure that I am interested in the book called Acts of Oblivion or Grants of Oblivion, which were kind of precursors to or very similar to amnesty. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, Acts of Oblivion were fairly rampant. And what they would do would be to tell people that they not only had to allow someone to go free if they had committed a crime, but also that they had to forget the very underlying acts. And so there's a lot of kind of satirical poetry about, well, should we forget that there even was an act of oblivion? And do we need to remember the act of oblivion in order to forget what happened? And this kind of prohibition even on raising certain acts in a court of law was part of the act of oblivion.
And go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say, I think we all ought to get 2 acts of oblivion for personal sins we've committed.
Definitely. I think acts of oblivion would be great to bring back in the age of the internet as well, if we could only kind of expunge the internet record for various things as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when you talk about the act of oblivion from 1660 is that's right at the end of the English Civil War, and they're basically forgiving the side that lost. Are they sort of the opposite to truth and reconciliation commissions?
Yes, I think they are, actually. And it's interesting because I think both are strategies for transitional justice, but truth and reconciliation has tended to be the strategy that's been most used recently. So I think that acts of oblivion, as I talk about in the book, are very helpful as a kind of tool for transitional justice in particular kinds of moments, especially when there haven't been extreme atrocities committed. So I think that acts of oblivion, if there has been a civil conflict, but it's not really clear which side is more to blame, they can be a very useful tool of transitional justice because they allow for the restoration of peace without a reanimation of conflicts on a personal level.
So one of the things in hearing you talk about this is, if you think about this versus Joe Arpaio, is sometimes this seems to be a kind of mass justice. So acts of oblivion or truth and reconciliation commissions. And sometimes the pardon is about a very specific person. And sometimes it's about guilt, and we feel the person has suffered enough. And sometimes it's about something really quite different. That is, Joe Arpaio is not being given a pardon because he's contrite or out of a sense of mercy. It's basically the president saying, I'm sorry you were convicted.
Exactly. So I think there are a lot of different rationales for pardoning and for amnesty. So just to kind of pick up on one point you're saying about mass justice, I think amnesty in acts of oblivion are much more about mass justice, whereas pardons have much more to do with a kind of individual grant to a particular person. And after the American Civil War, the Supreme Court, I think mistakenly said, well, pardon and amnesty are all the same thing. The president's pardon power includes amnesty. It's just kind of a comprehensive power, and they avoided the distinctions between the two things. I think when you're talking about Joe Arpaio, it's not about giving mercy because someone said, oh, I've sinned and I've repented. Maybe that would be like Claudio in Measure for Measure, who commits a kind of sin but feels sorry for it. But instead, it's about, I'm going to exercise my power as president to do this political act and to say, actually, I think that most of what this person did, I approve of, and I don't really care that he broke the law that much.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Bernie Meyler about her book, Theaters of Pardoning.
Well, let's bring up President Trump's use of the pardon power. We've talked about Joe Arpaio. Give us an overview. Is it different than how is it different than Obama's use, and how is it the same?
Yeah, so I think Obama was quite chary about using the pardon power for at least the first part of his presidency. And that's been characteristic of a lot of recent presidents. There's been a statistically identifiable decline in the use of pardons, partly because most prominent uses of pardoning have had a lot of political repercussions. So President Clinton was highly criticized for pardoning Mark Rich at the very end of his time in office. And I think Obama was quite worried about using pardoning. And for the most part, when he did start pardoning people more in the second term, he was using the office of the pardon attorney and the process, the kind of bureaucratic process of pardoning and reviewing pardons that is entailed by the office of the pardon attorney. So instead, President Trump has, for the most part, completely circumvented the regular routine screenings for pardons and has focused on very prominent individuals, whether it's Joe Arpaio or others, the ranchers whom he pardoned. He's looked at prominent cases that have a political dimension or are involving very salient public figures and has opted to pardon them. Often he's had a connection to the people or he's somehow approved of the policies that they've been enacting.
So the ranchers are the ranchers that protested against government regulation.
Exactly.
And
and then he pardoned Jack Johnson, who's been dead for, I don't know, at least a half century, after some famous singer or another showed up in his office and said, "Pardon Jack Johnson."
Exactly. So sometimes it seems to be through connections that he has friends who've said, pardon this person, or he's seen on TV a particular case and it's struck him as something he wants to intervene in. So he's been using the pardon to make political statements or make statements about, particular celebrities. Dinesh D'Souza is another person who he pardoned.
On some of them, I can understand. We have a list of people pardoned here, and I don't want to spring one on you, but how about Conrad Black? I can understand the political motivations of pardoning a rancher who was anti-government. I can understand the Arpaio, same thing. I can understand Jack Johnson, but Conrad Black was a British newspaper publisher convicted of fraud. What's the story you would tell on that, if any?
I'm not sure I have a good story for that. I mean, I don't have that much. I mean, he has been pardoning some people convicted of fraud, actually. So fraud is an interesting kind of thread through this. There was floated the possibility that he would pardon the former Illinois governor who was convicted of
Rod Blagojevich.
Right, exactly, yeah. Of corruption, various kinds of corruption. So fraud and corruption seem to be subjects of interest to the president, and he has pardoned people for similar kinds of offenses. But I'm not sure exactly in the Conrad Black case why he did it.
We'll be back with more from our guest, Bernie Meyler, talking about the pardon power here on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam. Bernie, before our break here, we were talking about President Trump's use of the pardon power. And there are a lot of businessmen, or at least one that we talked about, Conrad Black, who was pardoned. And it struck me that as a business person, you're going to be more sympathetic to people like yourself in a plight and sympathetic to people who err. And the law of fraud is a little bit complicated. So what do you think of that as a kind of an armchair explanation on why Black would get the pardon as opposed to 1 million people or 100,000 people convicted of other crimes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great explanation, Joe. And it actually has echoes in literature. So I talk about the play Measure for Measure, and I think one of the characters there, Aeschylus, really judges and has mercy because he identifies with other characters. So the characters he doesn't identify with, he has absolutely no pity for whatsoever. But he is very sympathetic when it comes to people of a similar social status and a similar background to him. So I think that we all tend to have empathy for people who are in plights that we might imagine ourselves being in as well. And so, businessmen might have complications with the law in terms of thinking about, what is fraud, what isn't, what are the lines, how do we draw the lines? And so I think that that's a great explanation.
Yeah, and it might also explain Dinesh D'Souza, right? Another person who makes kind of incendiary comments about racial issues in the United States and gets pardoned for campaign finance violations.
So I guess a question a lot of people are wondering, Bernie, is could Trump pardon himself?
I think that's a great question, and it's not one that I think there's a clear constitutional answer to. A lot of the material that I've looked at from an earlier period suggests that the common law really strongly disfavored judging in one's own case, and that idea was also applied to pardoning. So there, even from Sir Edward Coke in the early 17th century onwards, there are a lot of statements about how one can't be a judge in one's own case, that's a kind of fundamental principle within the common law. And if you think about pardoning as a kind of judging, right, you're deciding that someone doesn't deserve to be punished anymore, or you're granting remission of their punishment, judging oneself to be exculpated by pardoning seems like judging in one's own case. So I think you could make an argument that there is a kind of implicit in the pardon power, there's a restriction on pardoning in one's own case, but it's certainly not something that has ever come up in the past in American history, and so it's a pretty new issue.
Can I press you a little on this in the following way, which is the pardoning powers that came from England was, as you say in the book, a key piece of the king's sovereignty. And at least at common law, the king couldn't be held liable for anything because of sovereign immunity. And so it's a kind of weird power if it's really a power to be the sovereign and to be kind of prerogatory in your power. That is, there aren't rules on who you can pardon and who you can't in the same way there are about who you can convict and who you can't. So it's almost like an odd relic in that sense of a power that we don't think our president has, and yet we gave him this particular power, which came from a king who could do no wrong because the king's word was law in that sense.
Yes, I think it's an extremely odd power, and it's one of the powers that most looks like a sovereign prerogative power in the Constitution. And it is odd that we have it in the Constitution because even a lot of the colonies would give pardoning to a legislature, or at least have some legislative involvement, so that it wasn't the sole authority of the governor or the chief executive. So I think the fact that we have the pardon power vested in the president is quite odd. One of the restraints on pardoning that the founders thought would be powerful was the power of impeachment. So they thought that if the president abused the pardon power, he would just be impeached. Now, that hasn't worked out so well. It's very hard to manage impeachment. They also imagined that there would be kind of cabals involving particular kinds of power that haven't played out that way. Political parties weren't something that they really contemplated, so they didn't think about the possibility of pardoning along political lines, and that might be a bar on impeachment practically. So I think they thought of the impeachment power as a legislative check, but it hasn't proved to be a very effective one.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Bernadette Meyler about her book, Theaters of Pardoning. And in your last remark, you pointed to the governors and the colonies and pardoning power there. And of course, one thing that's important, I think, for readers to understand is the president can pardon you from convictions that involve federal crimes, but he can't actually pardon you for state crimes.
Exactly. And the president has no power to pardon anyone if they're convicted of state crime. So that's been one thing that has been discussed in relation to the Mueller report and related issues, that there's a question of whether certain kinds of corruption charges could be brought by states rather than by the federal government. In that case, President Trump would have no power to pardon anyone for those convictions.
One of the other things that President Trump has said recently, raising the pardoning power, concerns the wall. I mean, one question people are asking, can he pardon himself? Another question is, what if ahead of time you say, anyone that acts to help me build the wall, if they get in trouble with it, I'll pardon? Can you do that?
No, I don't think you can do that consistent with the constitutional scope of pardoning. So that's a lot more like what would have been called the suspending power in the English context. And the founders pretty clearly wanted to reject the power to suspend the law. So the British king could suspend a law with respect to the colonists for a particular period, or could suspend it with respect to particular people. And the members of the founding generation were really upset with the use of this power and didn't want the president or anyone else to be able to immunize people from obeying the law, right? It's Congress's ability to pass laws, and they need the president to approve them, but it's up to Congress to decide on what the law is and what it's not, rather than the president.
Yeah, and we only have the one suspension power in the Constitution, right? And that's a suspension of habeas corpus during wartime. So that would kind of suggest, by putting that in and not putting in other things, there's this legal doctrine that basically says if you include one thing, that sort of implies that you're excluding the others.
But what does that mean in practice? Suppose we say the president can't do this, and he just makes that statement. I get arrested for helping him build a wall somehow, and he pardons me. Do I lose because of his advance statement, where if he didn't make the advance statement, I could be pardoned?
I think that's a great question. I think that, some people have contemplated whether it's actually obstruction of justice to claim that you're going to pardon someone in advance of an illegal act that they're going to commit, right? So it might raise.
So then he has to pardon himself,
right,
for the obstruction of justice.
So, or we could prosecute him for obstruction of justice.
Or impeach
Say
him.
He can't pardon himself, but the person he pardons might still get off.
It's possible.
Wow.
Well, we've been talking with Bernie Meyler here about the president's pardon power. But we've done it through really a fascinating lens, which is, to start with, it's a lens of 17th century drama. And Bernie, we'd love to have you back to talk about the lens of current culture and how you think that's affecting our political process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating to realize how similar in some ways the current situation seems to be to situations that at first glance wouldn't seem familiar at all. I mean, it's just really interesting to see how an insight into another culture or another part of history gives us insight into where we are today. So thanks, Bernie, for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121.